سيداتي سادتي، ستبدأ أعمال الجلسة. يرجى العودة إلى أماكنكم. شكرا.
Ladies and gentlemen, the plenary session will start in a few minutes. Please take your seats.
Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to the second day of the WISE Summit. A special word of welcome to the chairperson of the Qatar Foundation and UNESCO Special Envoy, Her Highness Sheikha Moza bin Nasser. And welcome to our honorary guest, His Excellency the President of the Republic of Ghana, Nana Akufo-Addo. This morning's session is critical. We all know that war and conflict, violence, are a major cause of global instability. As of today, there are 65 million people who have been displaced. That's an astonishing figure. I'd like you to take a moment to just think about that, because it's not just a number. That's 65 million lives, 65 million stories, dreams, hopes, all shattered with little prospect of change. From Iraq to Yemen, South Sudan and Syria, war, violence and displacement have had a huge impact on future generations, their education and their chance at a better life. We've already seen how this kind of displacement can lead to a sense of hopelessness and radicalization. You need to take urgent action. There is some hope, and there are many people working to bring about some kind of change. To shed light on these challenges and to tell us where education is today, I welcome on stage our keynote speaker, His Excellency Nana Akufo-Addo, President of the Republic of Ghana.
Your Royal Highness, Deputy Prime Minister, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, members of the Ghanaian delegation. I'm grateful to the Education Above All Foundation, organizers of this year's World Innovation Summit for Education, for the opportunity and invitation, and thus an honor for me to be amongst you as we share ideas and create a platform for deliberations on the theme, Asset over Burden, Education for Refugee Youth. Well, Your Highness, ladies and gentlemen, upon my assumption of the high office of President of the Republic of Ghana in January this year, the very first appointment thrust on my modest shoulders was from the new Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres. He appointed me co-chair of the 2030 UN Sustainable Development Goals Advocates Group of Eminent Personalities. My duty, and that of all the members of the Advocates Group, which includes the highly respected Qatari, Her Highness Sheikha Moza bint Nasser, is to mobilize political support for the implementation of the 17 SDGs, which include ending poverty and hunger, improving health and education, making cities more sustainable, combating climate change, and protecting oceans and forests. All of these goals are aimed at promoting global development that leaves no one behind. A critical look at the SDGs, however, reveals that education is the key enabler and has the greatest multiplier in achieving the SDGs. SDG number 4 requires that we, quote, ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all, unquote. This particular goal impacts on addressing poverty, SDG Goal 1, enhancing health and nutrition, SDG Goal 3, promoting economic growth and labor market opportunities, SDG Goals 8 and 9, and reducing inequalities, SDG Goal 10, amongst others. It remains an undeniable fact that no country has been able to shed the evils of poverty, ignorance, and disease with a largely illiterate population. In a fundamental sense, education is the key to human development and to widening life's options for individuals and society as a whole. Education creates social mobility. It is the hope of every father and mother that education will help their children escape poverty and give them access to a good life. This, unfortunately, is not the case for the 66 million people forcibly displaced all over the world, out of which some 23 million are described as refugees. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, in a report, notes, quote, that refugees are 5 times more likely to be out of school than the global average. Only 50% of refugee children have access to primary education, compared with the global average of more than 90%, unquote. The gap, according to the same report, widens as these children become older. Quote, with only 22% of refugee adolescents attending secondary school, compared to a global average of 84%. At the higher education level, fewer than 1% of refugees attend university, compared to 34% at global level, unquote. This is not right. The specter of tens and tens of millions of young refugees growing up without the needed skills to create a meaningful life for themselves is a dangerous one. What do we expect them to do? What opportunities are available to them? How competitive can they be in this global economy? These are questions that must elicit a concerted and calculated response from the global community. In my view, education, and more education is the only way by which we can foster a sense of cohesion and solidarity amongst displaced persons, especially those of school-going age, and help create for them an enabling environment which will spur them on to lead more purposeful and dignified lives. If the noble goal of the SDGs is to ensure that no one is left behind, and among others, to guarantee education for all, then we must seek to empower those left behind as a result of war and conflict. We should commit ourselves to building a world where every child has the opportunity to better him or herself, and by so doing, better the global community. Your Highness, ladies and gentlemen, for those of us who come from a continent with the world's second fastest economic growth rates, the world's fastest growing region for foreign direct investment, and in possession of nearly 30% of the Earth's remaining mineral resources, it is disheartening, to say the least, to find that African youths do not see a future in their respective countries and are willing to cross the Sahara Desert on foot and drown in the Mediterranean Sea in a desperate bid to reach the mirage of a better life in Europe. With the majority of African economies dependent on the production and export of raw materials, who can blame them for wanting to leave? These economies cannot produce wealth and prosperity for the masses on the continent. It therefore drives the determination to seek a much better standard of living out of Africa, thereby fueling the refugee crises and the numerous counts of illegal migrations. We cannot continue traveling this worn path of limited success of being exporters of raw materials. Our problems require that we think outside of the box. Our thinking and approaching to solving problems must be different from the thinking and approach that brought about the problems in the first place. The only way to ensuring prosperity in Africa is through value addition activities in a transformed and diversified modern economy. In other words, the industrial development of our continent. This, however, can only be achieved with an educated workforce. The countries that have done well even without natural resources, are the countries that have invested in education and skills training. What the evidence from history and the experience of many countries have shown is that it is not natural resources that build nations. It is people who build nations. It is not gold, cocoa, diamonds, timber, or oil that is going to build Africa. If it was, it would have done so already. It is Africans, especially the youth of today, who are going to build Africa. That is why my country continues to do its best in ensuring that we place a high premium on education. We have significantly improved, well above the average in sub-Saharan Africa, in terms of access to early childhood care and education, free and compulsory primary education for all, improved literacy rates, amongst others. 2 months ago, in September, we started the free senior high school program, which aims to guarantee secondary education for all of Ghana's children. The program will ensure that all our children will be educated to at least secondary level, and money, or the lack of it, will no longer mean a denial of education. This has already led to an increase of over 90,000 children who have entered secondary school this academic year, who would have otherwise have dropped out at this stage. SDG 4 SDG 4, which aims at ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promoting lifelong learning opportunities for all, will be within our reach by the target date. All of this is being done because we want to throw open the doors of opportunity and hope to our young people and help build a new African civilization governed by the rule of law, respect for individual liberties and human rights, and the principles of democratic accountability, which will provide the basis for the new Africa of prosperity and dignity, no longer dependent on aid or charity. Education is the soil for growing dreams, and we are now at the point where we need rapidly to transform our country into a progressive and prosperous 21st century nation that remains distinctly and uniquely Ghanaian. We believe that today's youth running barefoot to school could be a future leader of business, industry, or government. Education is the equalizer of opportunity, and so it is vital for us at this turning point in our history and society. I thank you sincerely for your attention.
That's fine. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you again, Mr. President, for highlighting some of those challenges. And of course, you've also told us that education is central to achieving those sustainable development goals. So what's being done today? And to have a look more at the challenges that was raised by the President and the reality of the education crisis and what is actually being done on the ground, let's just show you a short video.
Wars, conflict, and the crisis of displacement that they create are far-reaching and ever-present. They add uncertainty to the future of our global community. Conflicts have contributed to a major crisis in education. Without immediate action, over half of the world's youth will be left behind and shut out of the opportunities provided by higher education. There are 22.5 million refugees around the world in search of a new home. Millions are displaced within their home countries. Over half of these people are under the age of 18. Unless we take action, most will not get the chance to attend school or university, nor aspire to the opportunities that education can provide to them and their communities. Without sufficient funding and stronger legal frameworks to stop attacks on education, the education gap will persist and widen, and conflicts will continue to destroy access to the human right of education. The ripple effect of that will be felt by all of us.
When violence erupted in 2012, Rohingya were forced from their homes, and out of terrible crimes against humanity being committed.
Humanitarians are having a hard time helping people in Yemen. The country was already suffering from food shortages.
An appeal by 89 humanitarian partners. At Education Above All, we're working on multiple fronts to overcome the barriers to education that conflict and lack of sufficient funding create. Our mission is to transform the lives of millions, granting new life chances, real hope, and opportunities to improve the lives of poor and marginalized women, children, and youth through providing quality education. We help the most marginalized to realize a new way of life, to navigate through challenges and create opportunities for themselves with holistic guidance, to empower them economically, to educate and inspire them, to motivate them to become leaders in their communities and restore in them their lost faith in humanity. We believe that education is the driver of human development. It can reverse the impact of conflict and change our world for the better.
So after watching that video, I'd like to ask the audience a question. We tried this yesterday, so you'll all have your red and green cards there with you. Red is for funding and green is for conflict. So the question to you is, what do you think is the biggest challenge to global education today? Conflict or funding? So conflict is green and red is for funding. Okay. So it's mostly green. We haven't given any cards to our officials. Her Highness doesn't have a card. But the majority of you have said conflict is the biggest issue. And this is something that we will talk to our panelists about as well, our expert panelists a little later in the program. So I have another question. And actually, to let you know, today the spending globally on education is 1.2 trillion. But the need is $3 trillion. At current levels of funding, we'll reach the 2030 SDG deadline by 2050. Now, another question to the audience, and this time you don't have to raise your cards, and it's also a question for our audience watching the live streaming. So please respond on Twitter using the hashtag @EAA_foundation. It's there on yours. The handle rather than the hashtag. It's @EAA_foundation. So the question is, it's on your screen, for every $1 spent on education, what do you think is the economic return? So A is $2 rather, B is $5, and C is $10. So get on Twitter, tell us what you think, and I'll give you the answer at the end of the session. Now, we've been speaking a lot this morning about the impact of conflict on the next generation. But let's speak to one young person who's met a lot of people on the ground and seen the true impact of all of this. Please welcome on stage Asma Fikri, a Qatar youth advocate. Nice to see you, Asma. So tell me, Asma, you're 23.
Yeah.
You're very young, and tell me why you've decided to become a youth advocate and advocate for education.
So here's the thing. This is all I've actually known. My 20th birthday actually coincided with Qatar Foundation's 20th anniversary, so this shaped who I am as a person. And I grew up in this era that was defined by a quest for knowledge, for academic attainment, for excellence, and it was driven by this vision to transform my country into one that's knowledge-based. And the impact is real, the effects are real. Thank you.
You've actually had some in-the-field experience.
Yeah.
You've been to Ethiopia, you've also been to meet Syrian refugees in Turkey. Tell me about the impact that's had on you personally.
So I met Syrian refugees. They were university students in Gaziantep University, and they were undergraduates, but they were 30 years old, or even more. And there was a humbling moment when I met them, and they looked at me and they said, look, you're 22, you graduated 2 years ago, you've been working, what advice do you have for us? And I felt like I was in absolutely no position to give them advice. I was lucky, and they were dealt inhumane cards. And then there was this saddening moment when they were asked a question that every student gets asked once, or usually 100 times, which is, what are you doing next? And they went silent, and they went silent many times during that trip that I had. And so I felt like they had this distorted reality. It was one that was shaped by displacement, by conflict, by hopelessness, and they deserved my reality. They deserved to be nurtured, to feel like there's hope in this world, and every child deserves that. So I was conflicted there, because I felt like it was a matter of luck, and it shouldn't be luck. It shouldn't be luck that every child can grow up in a place that's hopeful. It's just a human right. Oh.
There's a lot of policymakers here, there's a lot of government officials here. As a young person, what message do you have to them?
So I'm going to continue being a lifelong advocate for education. And that's because, I mean, the shape of the world today, it's not that great, but it's temporary. And we have children and we have youth that they're going to be tasked with the need to rebuild their societies, to find peace and reconciliation. And they need the tools to do that, right? They need an access to education, but they also need the right education, not a controlled narrative that could fuel even further religious, ethnic, and sectarian divides. They need one that teaches them to coexist, that pluralism is not an evil, it could be a blessing. But even beyond that, what I feel like and what I hope to see as a youth and as I grow in this world is a shift from approaching refugees with immediate humanitarian assistance that then become long-term silos into one that's development-based, that has their education and their employment at the very core of it, and that looks at how they can contribute to their host, but also how they can go back and rebuild their societies. They need the tools to do that, and it's not working today.
And just briefly, tell me what you'll do next.
So I'm going to continue working with youth. For the time being, as long as I'm a youth, I'm going to continue being a youth advocate. I'm going to work with local youth around the world. I want to empower them to take things into their own hands. I want them to identify the issues and find solutions themselves, because they're future leaders, but that doesn't mean that they don't need to be leaders today.
Asma, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Asma Fikri. So we've just heard there from Asma Fikri about the work that she's doing on the ground and the urgent needs required. But if I can please call my expert panelists to come up on the stage so that we can continue the conversation. Commissioner, nice to see you. Thank you. Hello. Hi. Hello. So let me introduce my panelists to you. Sitting right here beside me is Dr. Ala Murabit, the SDG Advocate for Health, Employment and Economic Growth. His Excellency, Commissioner Christos Stylianidis, the European Commissioner for Humanitarian Aid and Crisis Management. Mr. Kevin Murphy, the President of ExxonMobil Foundation. And Dr. Alan Goodman, President and CEO of the Institute of International Education. So clearly, there's tremendous challenges on hand, but before we start the panel and our conversation, we have a special message from Filippo Grandi, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees.
Good morning. It is an honor to address you at the Education Above All Foundation's WISE plenary session. A total of 65.6 million people were forcibly displaced worldwide at the end of 2016, a third of whom were refugees. This devastating trend has continued, with more than 2 million people already fleeing their country as refugees in 2017, driven by conflict and violence in South Sudan, Myanmar, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and elsewhere. This unprecedented number speaks louder than ever to the need for solidarity and common purpose in preventing and resolving crisis, and ensuring together that the world's refugees, internally displaced and asylum seekers are protected and supported. It also means helping them build a future and find their own paths towards solutions by investing in education, in livelihoods, in skills development. Around half of all refugees are school-age children, many of whom risk being left behind without a quality education. Only 6 out of 10 refugee children attend primary school, as compared to 9 out of 10 children globally. Denying refugees an education means denying them and their countries a future. This is why the work of the Education Above All Foundation is so critical, and why we at UNHCR are proud to partner with you. It is essential that we all redouble our efforts to provide quality education to refugees around the world and to help them set out on a path towards a peaceful and stable future.
So a message there from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Ala, I'll begin with you. I mean, laws to protect women and children continue to be breached. Schools continue to be attacked, hospitals continue to be attacked, and increasingly it feels as though institutions like the United Nations are redundant.
Is there a question in there?
It's a statement.
You know, I think it would be difficult to disagree in many ways that a lot of our global institutions, the UN included, are not doing their part. We have gotten very good at getting policies moved, passing resolutions, even to a degree financing particular issues. What we haven't got as good at is ensuring and incentivizing political will, because that is what it comes down to. I mean, I think the vast majority of us here know the statistics. We know the fact that the #1 solution for crisis around the world, whether it be from climate change or conflict, is the education of girls and women's health. That's it. That's what statistics have shown us. Empirical evidence has shown us if you educate a girl, she gets married later, she has less kids, she reinvests 90% of her economic capital back into her community. Education thrives, health thrives. Those are the statistics. And we know that at the United Nations. We know that in this room. And the reality is that political will and statistics and empirical data have to meet somewhere. And in order for us to ensure that, we have to start talking about the politicization of human rights. We have to start talking about what are our priorities and who gets to make those decisions. And if our core global institutions, be it the UN, the EU, other regional bodies, are not willing to say, listen, we have to prioritize human rights above and beyond all else. We will not pay to support smuggling routes in the Mediterranean. We will not pay to support countries when they bomb other countries. We will not fund and support and allow for those people to have platforms within our spaces. Until we do that, we can't realistically talk about anything else when it comes to education.
Commissioner, let me ask you, why is there not a political will? Why is it politicized? Why are human rights and humanitarian issues politicized, as Ala's just mentioned?
First of all, thank you so much for this kind invitation, and thank you, Highness, for your dedication, especially on education. I strongly believe, as European Commissioner, that definitely education is the most underfunded field, is the most underfunded policy. And this is why I decided, as Commissioner for Humanitarian Aid, from the beginning of my mandate, to increase our European humanitarian budget in education and emergencies by 8 times. Because I strongly believe that we need, of course, to focus to find peaceful processes on conflict, and the answer from the audience about your question was good, but at the same time, we need funding. We need funding in order to fund specific projects, especially in conflict areas. And this is why we saw in the 3 last years when I was in this mandate, a lot of projects in many affected countries in crisis, that through this project we can provide at least protection to the children in the very devastating situation. So from here, all of us, and this is my prayer, that we have to increase our advocacy to education as a long and medium-term process. At the same time, we have to persuade our colleagues in our governments, in our decision-making bodies, that education is not only a sort of luxury in crisis, it's a basic need. It is something beyond basic right, because only through education we can deal with the new phenomena of radicalization, forced recruitment, forced labor, forced marriage. And this is why we have to be our top priority, to provide education as a medium and long-term process, but also in emergency situation. Otherwise, we will see lost generation. We cannot afford lost generation. We cannot see again a lot of children to be out of school. Otherwise, the phenomenon of radicalization and all these things will increase. And I'm not sure that the international community, all of us, we can live with this new devastating phenomenon. And thank you so much, because this conference is a symbolic conference in order to raise awareness about education. And thank you for this very well organized conference, and it is a symbolic moment to send the message from here that all of us here, we are dedicated in order to increase the funding of education in all aspects.
Well, sitting beside you is a man who works for a company who has potentially a lot of money. So is the private sector willing to come on board, or what should the private sector do to assist with the funding of education globally?
I think that's a good question. I think the President mentioned the importance of the Sustainable Development Goals, and there's no question that the Sustainable Development Goals will require unprecedented collaboration and cooperation amongst governments, among private sector, amongst civil society, consumers. So I think that's where we begin. I also don't, as a society, I don't believe that we can achieve sustainable communities unless we grant access to education first. And appreciate particularly Her Highness Sheikh Moza's Educated Child effort, which is well on track now to provide access to over 10 million vulnerable children across the world. I think they're up to 50 countries at this point. So as a private sector participant, we certainly view our role as providing reliable and affordable energy to help sustain economic growth. We also can provide some technical and project management expertise, and I think that's where our role comes in. And we certainly, across the world where we operate, provide a number of social investments, both at local and national level.
Alan, you work with offering a lot of people scholarships and access to education, but how does a young refugee know about these scholarships? And we heard there the statistics from the President of Ghana that a lot of these refugees will never get higher education or tertiary education. How do they find out that these scholarships are available? And are you doing work in countries where they're feeling a lot of the burden of refugees, like Jordan, for example, or Turkey, Bangladesh?
Refugee and displaced students learn about opportunities often from each other and through social media and from the web. And what we need to do in higher education is own the refugee problem. The last time the world had 60+ million displaced people, only 3% went to college in any place in the world. Today it's a much higher number, so refugees and displaced people are university students. We know they know how to study. We know they know how to thrive if they get access to education. We know we have 20,000 universities in the world. Imagine if everyone took one. We have 10 million faculty in the world. Imagine if every practicing faculty member today said, I'm going to teach a refugee. Then that question you asked us, if you had $1, what was it leveraged to represent? In higher ed, if you put $1 into getting a refugee connected to a faculty member, connected to a university, any place in the world, it's not leveraged $5 or $10, it's thousands of dollars, because you don't have to build schools, we got them. You don't have to build faculty, we got them. We just need to make higher education and a window through which refugees and displaced people can go.
I'll bring you back into the conversation. The EU Commissioner just said that we need to not look at education as some kind of luxury. How do you make that cultural shift where people aren't just talking about it, but actually it's a basic human right?
I think that's ultimately the great challenge. I mean, we talk often about this, and I do think it's a false dichotomy between funding and between the causes of lack of education or the biggest crises, be it funding or conflict. The two go hand in hand. And the reality is, when we look specifically at conflict, and I'll start there, 90% of conflicts reoccur within 5 years of a peace process being signed. 90%. Which means in the vast majority of communities and countries where education is stunted or decimated for a period of time, it will continue to remain that way for a generation or two. So you are looking at a significant loss of brain power, of economic power, and that simply means that those conflicts will re-engage. So you can put money into that. You can put as much money into that as you want, but it is really like putting it into a black hole. If you do not create solutions for the underlying conflict, you cannot fund your way out of human rights abuses. You can't. You cannot fund your way out. You cannot fund your way out of a population, generations that don't have healthcare and don't have education. That's not something you can pay your way out of. And that's something that we do need to emphasize. Yes, more funding needs to go into education, but above and beyond all, we need to start talking about the underlying causes of conflict. And I come from a medical background. I'm a doctor by trade, so I'm going to give you a medical analogy. I always ask audiences, if you had an infection on your arm, and you went to your doctor, what would your doctor do? What should your doctor do? You can feel free to answer, gentlemen. Usually, if you have a good doctor, and I hope you do, your doctor will give you antibiotics and they will debride your arm. It will be painful, it will be, at the time, costly, and it's intensive. But it prevents you from coming back 2 weeks later with a gangrenous arm that you have to get amputated. Dealing with the underlying cause when it is happening, instead of putting a Band-Aid, throwing some money at it, saying we support, we have prayers, we have hope, etc., is so much better than coming back 6 months later, a year later, finding that a 99% rate of people in that country are no longer in school or do not have access to education, that child marriage has increased, that human trafficking has increased, that child labor and slavery have increased. The reality is we have to do it now. And politically, we have to hold our politicians to account, be it in the EU, be it your UN representatives, your local representatives. If you are not holding them to account in whichever country you are from, because this is a global problem, it will increase over time. With climate refugees and climate displacement, this is going to impact every country in the world. And if we are not holding our own local representatives to account and saying we want our national dollars to go to supporting and protecting children around the world, then it's very difficult for me to say, let's continue to finance things. We need to actually have structured political approach.
Commissioner, I'll bring you back in because... Sure.
Yes, I completely agree with my dear colleague. Also, I'm coming from the medical profession, and I strongly believe that prevention is better than cure. And this is why we have to focus on prevention in order to not only to avoid to pay money, but also to give money maybe sometimes in completely different ways for specific goals and objectives which are the most important for the youth and children. Please.
Because actually, Europe has now experienced firsthand the problems, whether it's been the migrant crisis, for example. We saw a wave of over 1 million people turning up just in 2015. So why hasn't the attitude shifted of leaders to resolve the issue in home countries rather than trying to find a problem within Europe? Find the solution, rather.
There is no doubt that the European Union has a comprehensive approach regarding conflicts, not only in our neighborhood, but also worldwide. And this is why we have to focus on completely very important diplomatic actions, political actions, in order to create fertile ground for a peaceful process. But at the same time, we have to deal with the urgent needs, with the urgent situation everywhere in our neighborhood, Syria, Iraq, Africa, and at the same time to find ways, practical ways, in order to give hopes and dignity to the refugee communities and displaced people. This comprehensive approach, I have to admit that sometimes is not so efficient, so effective. But the European Union remains a critical soft power in the world conflicts. I think our role is recognized as very positive and is very helpful in many of the conflicts. But at the same time, I have to admit we have to do more. We have to focus in...
Because there are the President of Ghana just mentioned they're losing their young people to Europe. There's 1 million people waiting in just Libya to come.
Yes. And this is why we are going to make the excellent conference next week in Africa in order to sit together with our partners in Africa and to deal with the root causes, because this is the most important, to find jobs there in Africa countries, to see how to deal with the problem of the investments, to bring investments in Africa in order to see the African youth to stay in their countries and to provide their objectives and their thinking to see their countries to develop in a good way in order to cover all objectives of their people. I strongly believe that the only way is to work together. The developed countries with the Africa and other countries.